I gave my whole life to my family. Every penny I earned, every hour of my youth, every dream I ever had. I thought love was enough to protect the home I built with my own hands. But one evening, my daughter walked in with a cold smile and said words I'll never forget. "We're moving in. You're moving out." No explanation, no gratitude, just the sound of strangers claiming my kitchen, my living room, my memories. That night, I left without a fight. Everyone thought I was broken. But they forgot something. I may be 68, but I've built more than walls in this house. I've built a lifetime of resilience, and when you've spent decades constructing a life, you also know exactly how to take it back. Quietly, legally, completely. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the front porch, warming the peeling white paint that Eleanor Whitaker had never gotten around to fixing. She sat for a moment on the top step, feeling the familiar creak beneath her weight, and let her eyes roam over the yard. The rose bushes were budding early this year. She made a mental note to cut a few blossoms before Caroline arrived. 40 years in this house, and she still noticed the smallest changes. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Eleanor had spent the morning scrubbing the kitchen counters and mopping the hardwood floors, not because they were dirty, but because she wanted everything perfect. She smoothed the tablecloth over the dining table, her fingers lingering on the embroidered edge. A wedding gift from her late husband, Peter. It had survived decades of meals, holidays, and quiet dinners, for one. In the kitchen, a pot of chicken soup simmered gently. Eleanor had chosen the recipe carefully. Caroline used to call it the cure for everything when she was a little girl. She could still picture the child who came home from school with scraped knees or a broken heart, sitting at this table, spoon in hand, comforted by a meal made with love. Those memories lived in the walls, in the worn wood of the chairs, in the faded photographs that lined the hallway. She moved to the living room, adjusting a framed picture on the mantel. Caroline at 7, missing her 2 front teeth, grinning proudly after winning the school's spelling bee. Caroline at 17, flushed with excitement at her high school graduation, wearing the necklace Eleanor had sold her grandmother's bracelet to buy. That day had been one of Eleanor's proudest. She'd worked overtime at the library for months, never once telling Caroline about the sacrifices behind the gift. That was what mothers did. They gave without expecting thanks. A quiet ache settled in her chest. The last few years had not been easy between them. Since Peter's passing, Caroline had been distant, visits dwindling to quick phone calls and holiday cards signed with her husband's name first. Still, when the call came earlier in the week, "I'd like to come by, Mom. We should talk." Eleanor had felt a spark of hope she thought was long gone. Maybe this was the moment they would bridge the silence. She stepped into the guest room to fluff the pillows. It smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she kept in the drawers. A small vase stood ready on the nightstand for fresh flowers. Eleanor had even ironed the spare set of sheets, something she hadn't bothered with in years. It was a small ritual, but it felt like a welcome. By late afternoon, the house was as ready as she could make it. The soup was ladled into a ceramic tureen, kept warm on the stove. The dining table gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, each place setting arranged with care. Eleanor placed a bottle of wine on the sideboard, Caroline's favorite, a Pinot Noir from a local vineyard they had visited together on a rare mother-daughter outing. As she moved through the house, Eleanor's mind wandered to the early years with Peter. They had built this home from a modest blueprint, stretching every dollar to afford the mortgage. She remembered late nights painting the walls themselves, laughing when their first attempt at wallpaper ended in disaster. Back then, the house was noisy with life. Caroline's piano practice, Peter's radio playing baseball games, the hum of the dishwasher after family dinners. Now, it was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor paused in the hallway, listening to the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. She felt the weight of the years pressing in, the way time had shifted the shape of her family until it no longer quite fit around her. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight, there was the possibility of something mending. She checked the clock again, nearly 6:30. Caroline would be here soon. Eleanor pulled on a soft cardigan, the one Peter had always said brought out the blue in her eyes. She took a final look around the living room, adjusting a throw pillow and making sure the photo albums were stacked neatly on the coffee table. If the conversation went well, maybe they would sit together and flip through the pages, remembering the good times. In the kitchen, she ladled 2 generous bowls of soup and set them on the table. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of thyme and roasted chicken. For a moment, Eleanor let herself imagine Caroline walking through the door, smiling the way she used to and saying, "It smells wonderful in here, Mom." Outside, the sky deepened into twilight. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a warm glow over the front steps. Eleanor's heart quickened at the sound of a car approaching. She smoothed her hair in the hallway mirror, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. The reflection staring back at her was older than she felt inside, but her eyes still held that glimmer of hope. She stood by the front door, waiting for the knock that would signal a new chapter. The soup was hot, the wine was breathing, the house was ready. And so was she. The phone rang just as Eleanor was folding the napkins into neat triangles. The familiar chime startled her in the quiet house, and she wiped her hands quickly on her cardigan before picking up. "Hi, Mom." Caroline's voice carried the same smooth tone Eleanor remembered, but there was something else beneath it. A faint hesitation, like someone carefully choosing each word. "Caroline." "Oh, it's so good to hear from you," Eleanor said, warmth flooding her voice. "I've been getting things ready for tonight. I'm making your favorite soup, and About that." Caroline's pause was almost imperceptible. "Don't go to too much trouble. We'll probably just talk. Nothing big." Eleanor felt her smile falter, though she tried to keep her voice light. "Nonsense. You deserve a proper meal. I even found that Pinot Noir you like from Stony Brook Vineyards." A small laugh came through the line, but it sounded hollow. "You always remember." "How could I forget?" Eleanor leaned against the counter, letting the past drift back. "You were 18 when we went there. We just paid your first semester's tuition. Remember? We had to share one sandwich because She stopped herself, but the memory pushed forward anyway, because I'd sold Grandma's sapphire ring to cover the last installment. There was silence on the other end. Eleanor could still picture the ring, a deep blue stone surrounded by tiny diamonds passed down from her mother. It had been the most valuable thing she owned. She hadn't hesitated for a second when the tuition bill came due. Caroline had cried when she found out, hugging her tightly and saying she'd pay her back one day. Eleanor had never wanted the money back. The real payment was seeing her daughter step into the future without debt weighing her down. "You really didn't have to do that back then," Caroline said finally, her tone softer but still guarded. "I wanted to. That's what mothers do." A long breath on the line, then Caroline's voice returned, brisker now. "Anyway, we'll be there around 7. I should go. Lots to do before we leave." Eleanor hesitated. "Will it just be you and Evan? Should I set out the good china for 4 or—" Another pause. "Actually, Evan's parents will be coming too. I hope that's okay." The warmth in Eleanor's chest cooled slightly. "Of course it's okay. I haven't seen them in years." Caroline's laugh this time was shorter, almost distracted. "Right, well, we'll talk more when we get there. Don't wear yourself out, okay?" "I won't," Eleanor lied. "See you soon, sweetheart." The line clicked, and the house seemed to grow quieter than before. Eleanor stood for a moment with the phone still in her hand, the conversation replaying in her mind. The details didn't quite fit together. The way Caroline's tone shifted when Eleanor mentioned the past, the evasive answers about dinner, the sudden inclusion of Evan's parents. She shook it off and returned to the table, but her movements felt slower now. She refolded the napkins, straightened the silverware again, anything to keep her hands busy. The clock ticked on, each second a soft reminder that time was moving towards something unknown. As she moved into the living room, Eleanor's eyes caught the photo of Caroline at her college graduation. She remembered that day vividly, the sea of caps and gowns, the pride swelling in her chest as Caroline crossed the stage. Afterward, they'd stood together for a photo, the sun in their eyes, Caroline clutching her diploma. Evan had been there too, grinning, his arms slung loosely around her shoulders. Eleanor had thought he seemed restless, even then glancing at his watch during most of the ceremony. She pushed the thought away and returned to the kitchen, checking the soup. The smell was rich and comforting, but it didn't chase away the uneasy twist in her stomach. She poured herself a small glass of water, sipping slowly, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a car passed by, its tires crunching over the gravel at the end of the driveway. Eleanor glanced toward the window, half expecting to see a familiar face, but the vehicle continued down the road. She told herself she was being silly. Tonight was about reconnecting, not worrying. Still, as she moved through the house, making last-minute adjustments, her mind kept circling back to the phone call. Caroline's voice had carried an edge Eleanor couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, exactly. More like resolve. In the hallway, she paused to straighten a photograph of her and Peter on their wedding day. His smile in the picture was open and certain, the kind of smile that told her everything would be all right. She rested her fingers briefly against the glass, drawing a little strength from the memory before continuing. The clock chimed the half hour. Eleanor took a deep breath and tried to shake off the unease. Whatever was coming, she told herself, she would meet it with grace. She had prepared the home, the meal, and herself. Now, all she could do was wait. Headlights swept across the front windows, throwing shifting shadows on the living room walls. Eleanor's heart lifted for a brief, naive moment. She smoothed her cardigan, straightened her posture, and opened the front door before the knock came. Caroline was the first to step into the porch light. She wore a tailored black coat buttoned up to her chin, her hair pulled back too tightly. No warm smile, no outstretched arms. Her eyes flicked past her mother into the house, as though checking to see if things were in order. "Caroline," Eleanor greeted softly, her arms half raised in the hope of an embrace. Behind her daughter came Evan, tall and broad-shouldered, the faint scent of cologne failing to mask something sharper. Alcohol, perhaps. His eyes didn't meet hers. Two more figures followed, and Eleanor's stomach sank. Richard and Sylvia Hale, Evan's parents, stepped forward as if crossing the threshold of a property they already owned. Eleanor's smile faltered, but didn't vanish. "Come in, all of you. Dinner's ready, soup and—" "We won't be staying for dinner," Sylvia interrupted, her voice clipped. She glanced around the living room with cool appraisal, as though evaluating furniture in a showroom. "We have business to discuss." Eleanor blinked. "Business?" Evan moved past her without waiting, his heavy footsteps carrying him into the dining room. He glanced at the table settings, the wine, the steaming tureen of soup, and smirked faintly. Richard followed, pulling a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket. Caroline stepped inside last, closing the door behind her. Her posture was rigid, her chin high. "Mom, we've talked it over. We're moving in here. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay." The words landed like a blow, knocking the air from Eleanor's lungs. For a second, she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry." "What?" Richard looked up from his notebook. "The house is under your name, yes, but Caroline's family needs a stable place right now. You have more space than you need, and—" "This is my home," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Peter and I built this together. I've lived here 40 years. Every inch of it is more than one person requires," Sylvia cut in smoothly. "Think of it as reallocating resources. Families take care of each other." Evan leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "It's not like we're throwing you out on the street. You can find a nice apartment, something smaller, more manageable." Eleanor's gaze snapped to her daughter. "Caroline?" Caroline's eyes were cold, unreadable. "It's the best decision for everyone. Evan's work is closer to this side of town, and his parents can help with the mortgage. You don't have to worry about upkeep anymore." "I'm not worried about upkeep," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now, with hurt more than fear. "I'm worried about the fact that you think you can walk into my home and tell me to leave it." "It's just a house, Mom," Caroline replied, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Discomfort, maybe. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Richard began pacing the living room, jotting notes in his book. 4 bedrooms, renovated kitchen, hardwood floors in excellent condition. Market values strong right now. Eleanor stared at him. "Are you appraising my home?" "It's going to be our home soon," Evan said, his smirk widening. The room tilted slightly in Eleanor's vision. The warmth she had prepared for this evening, the soup, the wine, the careful arrangement of photographs, all of it now felt like a cruel joke. She drew a slow breath, forcing her hands to unclench. "And where exactly do you expect me to go?" Sylvia's lips curved in a small, condescending smile. "That's up to you. But the sooner you pack a few essentials, the smoother this will be for everyone." Caroline stepped forward, her tone firm. "You can stay with Aunt Margaret for a while, or find a short-term rental. We'll help you move your things out." Eleanor's gaze moved from face to face. Her daughter's cold determination, Evan's smug satisfaction, Richard's calculating detachment, Sylvia's thinly veiled disdain. It was like looking at strangers wearing the faces of people she had once trusted. The clock in the hallway ticked on, each second stretching the silence. Finally, Eleanor nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said quietly. For a moment, they all looked thrown off by her compliance. She turned toward the hallway closet, retrieving her old leather overnight bag. The zipper's rasp echoed in the room. "I'll take a few things for now," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "Just the essentials." No one noticed the way her eyes sharpened as she passed them. She carried her bag into the bedroom, her mind already moving. Not toward where she would sleep tonight, but toward how she would take back what was hers. Caroline didn't even glance at the soup waiting on the table. She brushed past Eleanor, her heels clicking on the hardwood, the sound sharp and final. There was no embrace, no polite pause at the door. She moved with the certainty of someone entering her own home, not her mother's. Eleanor stood frozen for a heartbeat, the open door spilling cold night air into the hall. Richard and Sylvia trailed in behind their son, their eyes sweeping over every detail, the furniture arrangement, the art on the walls, as if making an inventory. Evan, hands in his coat pockets, gave Eleanor a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't get the wrong idea, Eleanor. This is just temporary. We need a place to land for a while. You know how it is. Work's been unstable, rent's gone up." Before Eleanor could respond, Sylvia's voice cut clean through the room. "Of course, once we're settled, it'll make sense to formalize things. A joint ownership agreement, perhaps. That way this house becomes part of the family's shared assets." Her tone wrapped around the word family like barbed wire hidden in silk. Eleanor's eyes snapped to Caroline. "Joint ownership? That's not what you said on the phone." Caroline didn't answer. She looked away, studying a photograph on the mantel. One of her and Peter, taken at the beach when she was 10. The silence was answer enough. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Evan wandered toward the kitchen, opening cabinets without asking, making a low whistle at the stocked shelves. "Plenty of room here. We can move our things in easily. Just a few adjustments." Eleanor's pulse thudded in her ears. The part of her that wanted to shout, to tell them all to get out, rose like a wave, but something in her mind pulled back the tide. A memory flickered. Last year, renewing her homeowner's insurance policy after the roof repairs. Peter had always been meticulous with paperwork, and she'd kept the same habit. The policy was in her name alone, tied directly to the property deed. Any change of ownership would trigger mandatory reassessment, and a process that could stall for months, even years. The thought slid into her mind like a key into a lock. She kept her expression neutral, letting the details settle in her memory. Not now, not yet. Richard was still pacing, jotting notes. "We'll need to get rid of some of this old stuff to make room for our furniture," he said casually. "I know a dealer who might take the dining set." Eleanor moved to the head of the table, resting her fingertips on the carved wood. Peter had built this table himself during their second year in the house, sanding it until it gleamed. She could see his hands in every curve of the legs, every smooth edge. The idea of strangers selling it off was almost enough to make her lose her composure. Instead, she inhaled slowly, forcing calm into her voice. "It's a solid table. It's lasted 40 years. I expect it'll last another 40. Sylvia smiled thinly. "Well, sometimes you have to let go of the old to make way for the new." Caroline's voice was quieter but no less firm. "Mom, it'll be easier for everyone if you start packing tonight. Just the essentials for now. We'll help with the rest later." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment, searching for some flicker of guilt or hesitation. She found none. The girl she had raised, the one who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, was nowhere in sight. "Fine," Eleanor said at last. The single word seemed to hang in the air, heavier than it should have been. She left them in the living room and went to her bedroom, closing the door behind her. Inside, the quiet wrapped around her like armor. She opened the closet, pulling down her old leather bag, the one she'd used on weekend trips with Peter. As she placed folded sweaters and a pair of slacks inside, her mind replayed Sylvia's slip of the tongue, Evan's false assurances, Richard's casual talk of selling her furniture. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. It was a takeover. Her gaze drifted to the locked file box on the top shelf. Inside were the deed, the insurance policy, and every receipt from the repairs they had made over the years. She traced the box's edge with her fingertips, her lips tightening. She zipped the bag closed and straightened, her expression smoothing into something unreadable. When she emerged into the hallway, the others were still talking in low voices, already making plans. Eleanor set the bag by the door. "I'll go tonight," she said evenly. Caroline blinked, as if surprised by her compliance. Evan smirked again. Sylvia's expression was one of quiet triumph, but none of them noticed the look in Eleanor's eyes. Sharp, calculating, like an architect studying a building for its weakest points. The March night air bit at Eleanor's cheeks as she stepped off her own porch for what felt like the first time as an outsider. The leather bag in her hand seemed heavier than it had any right to be, the zipper pulling slightly against its overstuffed seams. She didn't look back, not at the light glowing in the living room windows, not at the silhouettes moving inside as though they'd already claimed it all. Her old Honda Civic sat waiting at the curb, a thin film of dust on the hood. She slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of worn upholstery wrapping around her. For years, this car had taken her to work, to church, to grocery trips with Peter. Tonight, it was taking her away from everything. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after 9 p.m. in a small residential neighborhood. Eleanor drove without turning on the radio, her thoughts loud enough. She passed the elementary school where she'd once volunteered for every bake sale, the park where she and Peter had watched Caroline learn to ride a bike, the coffee shop where she had met her friends on Saturday mornings before life had gotten smaller. 15 minutes later, she pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Pinecrest Motel. The neon sign buzzed in the cold air, casting a pinkish glow over the row of doors. Inside the front office, a young man in a faded hoodie looked up from his phone long enough to hand her a registration form. "One night or more?" he asked without inflection. "3 nights," Eleanor replied, sliding cash across the counter. Room 6 smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and something older, stale air that no amount of open windows could erase. The bedspread was patterned in muted browns and greens, the carpet worn thin near the door. She set her bag on the chair, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the silence close in. It wasn't the first time she'd been alone. She'd lived without Peter for nearly 6 years now. But this felt different. This was not the solitude she had chosen. This was exile. She tried to picture what Caroline might be doing at that moment. Laughing with Evan in the kitchen? Showing Sylvia where she kept the fine china? The thought scraped at her chest. She could have called someone. An old friend, her sister in Salem. But the idea of explaining what had happened was unbearable. What could she say that wouldn't sound like a failure? Her phone stayed silent on the nightstand. No messages, no missed calls. The absence of Caroline's name on the screen felt like its own kind of message. By morning, Eleanor forced herself into a small routine. She walked to the diner 2 blocks away for coffee and eggs, her only conversation the waitress's automatic "cream with that." She returned to the room to read a paperback she found in the nightstand drawer, but the words blurred after a few pages. The television offered noise, but not comfort. She flipped through channels, game shows, news reports, old sitcoms, until the laugh tracks felt like mockery. By the second night, she realized no one had asked where she was. No neighbor called to check in. No distant cousin sent a text. Even Aunt Margaret, the supposed temporary refuge Caroline had offered as an option, hadn't reached out. It was as though she'd been erased from the map of their lives in a single evening. Lying in the motel bed, she stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster with her eyes. The quiet pressed down heavier here than it had at home. There, the silence had been filled with memory. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the hallway floorboards, Peter's laughter echoing faintly in her mind. Here, there was only the hum of the vending machine outside and the occasional thud of footsteps from the room above. On the third morning, Eleanor took a slow walk through the surrounding streets. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and exhaust. She passed a small thrift store, its windows cluttered with mismatched dishes and old lamps. For a moment, she considered going in just to browse, but she kept walking. Her phone was still silent when she returned to the room. She set it on the table and stared at it, daring it to ring. It didn't. The loneliness didn't just sit beside her. It wrapped itself around her ribs and squeezed. That evening, she made a cup of tea in the small motel coffee maker. She sat by the window, watching the glow of headlights pass along the street. Somewhere out there, her house stood with its warm lights and the scent of her soup still lingering in the air. But she wasn't in it. She thought of Peter then, of the promise they'd made to always protect what they'd built together. The ache in her chest deepened. For the first time since leaving, she let the tears come. Quiet, steady, and unremarkable, but unstoppable. No one would know she cried. No one would ask why. From the street, Pinecrest Motel looked like the sort of place where people disappeared without notice, and Eleanor intended to use that to her advantage. Inside room 6, the curtains were drawn tight, the bed pushed slightly toward the wall to make space for a card table she'd bought from the thrift store down the block. On its surface lay a growing array of items, a stack of manila folders, a second-hand laptop, a spiral notebook filled with dates and observations. What had started as a desperate attempt to feel less powerless was becoming something sharper, more deliberate. A command center disguised as a motel room. She'd retrieved her locked file box from the closet before leaving the house, slipping it into her car while Caroline and the others discussed furniture in the living room. Now the contents were spread neatly before her. The deed to the house, the homeowner's insurance policy, receipts from every improvement she and Peter had made. Next to them sat printouts from the county's online property database and several recent bank statements she had quietly accessed before leaving. By day, she blended into the background, the older woman with a tote bag at the laundromat, the quiet diner customer who tipped in cash. But by evening, she sat at the card table combing through public records, social media profiles, and anything else she could find about Caroline's household. The first thing she confirmed was that Evan's construction business had been struggling for months. Invoices unpaid, projects stalled. A quick search of court records revealed 2 small claims judgments against him. It wasn't much, but it hinted at deeper trouble. That night, she opened a cheap prepaid phone she'd bought with cash and set up an email account under a name no one would recognize. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was preparation. By the 3rd day in the motel, her wall was a quiet collage of printed documents and handwritten notes. Every person in that house had a file. Caroline, Evan, Richard, Sylvia. Next to each name, a growing list of vulnerabilities. But even commanders need to eat. That evening, she set aside the files and walked to the diner. The place smelled faintly of fried onions and coffee grounds. She ordered a simple dinner: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a slice of apple pie. The first bite of potatoes brought back a memory so vivid she had to put down her fork. Caroline had been 7, feverish and small under a mountain of blankets. The doctor had said it was the flu, but Eleanor had stayed by her side for 3 nights straight, feeding her broth 1 spoonful at a time. On the second night, when Caroline had finally eaten a few bites of mashed potatoes, Eleanor had felt as though she'd been handed a miracle. She could still see that little face looking up at her, cheeks flushed, whispering, "Thanks, Mommy." The memory made her chest ache in a way no amount of strategy could armor against. She finished her dinner slowly, carrying the taste of that memory back to the motel. Sitting on the bed afterward, she let the softer part of herself have a few minutes, the part that missed her daughter more than she hated what she'd done. But when she turned back to the card table, her eyes were clear again. The next day brought the breakthrough. She'd been digging through online public records for Evan's business when she stumbled across something else. A lien filed by a local lender, secured against anticipated equity from residential property. The address listed was hers. She read it twice to be sure. Evan had taken out a loan and the collateral wasn't his current apartment. It was the projected market value of her house. The date on the document was recent, only a month before Caroline's phone call inviting her to dinner. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. This wasn't about family convenience. This was about survival. Theirs, at her expense. The thought sent a current of energy through her, sharper than anything she'd felt in weeks. She looked over at the neat stacks of files, the laptop, the insurance documents. Every piece was another brick in the foundation of what she was building. Her next move had to be precise. She closed the folder on Evan and reached for her notebook. In careful, deliberate handwriting, she added a new line under his name. Primary leverage point. Debt tied to house. Possible breach of property rights. The pen hovered for a moment, then she added, objective. Remove his access before foreclosure or sale becomes possible. When she set the pen down, she realized she was smiling, not with joy, but with the satisfaction of an engineer, seeing the first part of a blueprint take shape exactly as planned. Out on the street, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the curtains. Eleanor didn't move. She had vanished from their sight, but she was far from gone. It happened on a Tuesday morning, in the most ordinary way possible. Eleanor was standing in line at the hardware store, holding a new padlock and a small toolkit she'd decided to buy for the motel room. Ahead of her, a man about her age was talking to the cashier about repairing an old gate hinge. "You can fix that yourself," the cashier said, handing the man his change. "Just need the right tools and a bit of patience." The man chuckled. 40 years working with my hands. You learn a thing or two." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest. She'd worked with her hands, too. Not in the same way, but enough to keep a house running, to solve problems Peter hadn't been able to get to before his health failed. She remembered wiring a new porch light one winter evening, tightening the last screw just as snow began to fall. Peter had called her his engineer after that, and she'd laughed, but the name had stuck in her mind. Now, standing there in the queue, she realized she still was that person. She'd let Caroline and the others treat her like an obstacle to be moved aside, but she was more than that. She was a problem solver. She could design, build, and adapt. When it was her turn, she paid in cash and carried the bag back to the motel. The air felt different, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted slightly in her favor. In the quiet of room 6, she opened the toolkit, running her fingers over the familiar shapes. Pliers, a wrench, a small screwdriver set. They were simple tools, but in the right hands, they could change outcomes. She sat at the card table and looked over her files again. Each detail, the lien on her house, the insurance policy, the receipts, was like a component in a larger machine. If she put them together correctly, they could create movement. The moment of clarity was almost physical. She straightened in her chair, feeling her shoulders square and her breath deepen. The past weeks had been about survival, but now she could see the outline of something more, a plan to reclaim what was hers. She took a fresh sheet of paper and drew a column down the center. On one side, she wrote, assets. On the other, weaknesses. Under assets, she listed everything she had: legal documents, savings, knowledge of the house's history, and most importantly, the truth. Under weaknesses, she listed their flaws: Evan's debt, Richard's habit of cutting corners in business, Sylvia's dependency on appearances, Caroline's shaky job history. The page filled quickly. It wasn't just about knowing where they stood, it was about knowing where they could be pushed. That afternoon, she tested herself in small ways. She disassembled the broken latch on the motel's window and repaired it using only the tools she'd bought. She mapped out a bus route that would take her past both the county records office and Evan's job site without attracting notice. She timed herself moving from the table to the door with her most important files packed and ready, in case she needed to leave quickly. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about control. Around sunset, she walked to the park 2 blocks away. The air was cool, and the bare branches of the trees cut sharp lines against the fading sky. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter carrying across the grass. She watched them for a while, remembering afternoons when Caroline had begged for just 5 more minutes before heading home. Back then, she'd thought her sacrifices were temporary, that once Caroline was grown, the balance would shift, and she'd finally rest. But now she saw it clearly. She had given without measuring, and in return she had been treated as though she owed them more. The thought no longer stung as it had before. Instead, it lit a small, steady fire inside her. By the time she returned to the motel, the streetlights had come on. She closed the curtains, set the new padlock on the door, and sat down at the table again. The paper with her assets and weaknesses list was still there. She picked up her pen and drew a single line beneath it, writing in deliberate, steady letters. This is not the end. This is the blueprint. She leaned back, letting the weight of the words settle. Tomorrow, she would begin the first steps. Tonight, she allowed herself one rare smile, not of joy, but of certainty. The next morning, Eleanor took a slow walk toward the little grocery store 2 blocks over. She wasn't expecting to see anyone familiar, but as she passed the flower stand near the corner, she heard a voice call her name. "Eleanor, is that you?" She turned and saw Margaret Lane, her old next-door neighbor from Maple Street. Margaret's hair had gone almost entirely silver, but her eyes were as quick and warm as ever. "I thought you'd moved away," Margaret said, stepping closer. "Haven't seen you at the house lately." Eleanor forced a small smile. "Just taking some time to myself." Margaret's gaze softened. "I'll never forget what you did for us when Danny was in high school. That scholarship you found for him. If you hadn't made those calls, he might never have gone to college." The memory was a gentle one. Sitting at her kitchen table with stacks of paperwork, helping a shy 17-year-old navigate applications his parents didn't understand. Danny had graduated with honors and was now a teacher. "I'm glad it worked out," Eleanor said quietly. Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I don't know if it's my place, but I heard something you might want to know. Folks around the street are saying Caroline and that husband of hers are planning to sell your place. Some realtors already been by to look at it." Eleanor's breath caught, but she kept her expression steady. "Is that so?" "That's what I heard. I thought, well, you'd want to know." "Thank you, Margaret." Her voice was calm, but inside, something shifted. She had suspected they wanted the house for themselves, selling it outright. That was another betrayal entirely. They chatted briefly about small things, the weather, Margaret's grandchildren, before parting. Eleanor carried the weight of the conversation back to her motel room like a hidden stone in her pocket. Once inside, she set her groceries on the counter and went to the small storage box she kept under the bed. She had thrown most of her possessions into it in a hurry that night she'd left, but she hadn't looked through it since. Halfway down, beneath a folded quilt, she found an envelope worn soft at the edges. Her name was written across it in Peter's handwriting, the loops and slants instantly familiar. She sat on the bed and unfolded the paper inside. "Ellie," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say it out loud. You've always been the heart of this house. More than the walls and the roof, you built it with your hands, your patience, your sacrifices. Whatever happens, promise me you'll always protect what we built together." Her fingers tightened on the paper. The smell of old ink and paper mingled with the faint scent of cedar from the quilt. She could almost hear Peter's voice, steady and certain. The sadness rose first, a heavy, familiar tide. But then, beneath it, something else stirred. Peter had never been one for empty sentiment. His words were a charge, a task. Protect what we built. She read the letter twice more, each time feeling less like a victim and more like the custodian of something worth fighting for. By the time she folded it back into the envelope, her mind was already turning toward action. That afternoon, she walked to the bus stop with a different kind of purpose. The ride downtown was long, but it gave her time to organize her thoughts. The law office of Alan Whitmore was on the third floor of an aging brick building, the kind of place where the walls smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Alan had been Peter's attorney for years, handling everything from the purchase of their home to updating their wills. When she stepped into his office, Alan looked up from a stack of papers and smiled faintly. "Eleanor, it's been too long." I wish it were under better circumstances," she replied, taking the seat he offered. She laid the deed, the insurance policy, and a copy of the lien documents on his desk. "I believe my son-in-law has taken out a loan against my home without my consent, and now I've heard they're planning to sell it." Alan's brow furrowed as he read through the papers. "You're listed as the sole owner on the deed and the sole insured party on the policy. If they've made any moves to sell or encumber the property without your signature, that's a serious violation." "I want to stop them," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Legally, properly, but completely." Alan nodded slowly. "We can file an injunction to prevent any sale or transfer of ownership while we investigate. It will freeze any pending transactions. Then, if necessary, we can move toward a full legal claim for damages and fraud." Eleanor leaned back, feeling the shape of a plan beginning to solidify. "Do it." As Alan gathered the documents and began drafting the necessary forms, Eleanor thought of Peter's letter. Protect what we built. By the time she left the office, the winter sun was low over the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She clutched her bag with both hands, the envelope inside like a heartbeat against her palm. The fight had begun, and this time she would be the one setting the terms. The morning after her meeting with Alan, Eleanor woke before dawn. The motel room was still and dim, the only sound the low hum of the heater in the corner. For a moment, she stayed under the thin blanket, letting the warmth linger, but there was no sense in wasting daylight. She had decisions to make, and for the first time in weeks, they were hers alone. By 7, she was at the small cafe down the block, a place with chipped mugs and strong coffee. She took a table by the window, spreading her notebook out beside her cup. On one page, she wrote in large block letters, "New life, non-negotiables." Underneath, she listed what she wanted, not just to survive, but to live. A safe place that was truly hers. Financial independence, the ability to protect what she loved without relying on anyone else's permission. She thought about the jobs she could take. Her savings were modest but steady, and she could supplement them. Years ago, she'd handled bookkeeping for the local library. She still knew her way around a ledger. Maybe the bookstore on Main Street needed part-time help. The idea of being surrounded by books again made her smile. After breakfast, she walked to the community center. The front desk clerk, a young man in a bright scarf, handed her a brochure for adult skills programs. "We've got computer literacy, small business workshops, even DIY home repair," he said. Eleanor tucked the pamphlet into her bag. She didn't need most of those skills. She could rewire a lamp and balance a budget blindfolded, but the idea of learning something new appealed to her. Back at the motel, she made a few phone calls. By noon, she had 2 interviews lined up, one with the bookstore owner, the other with a small accounting firm that needed temporary help during tax season. The rest of the day was about small acts of independence. She replaced the cheap motel lamp bulb herself, fixed the wobbly table leg with a shim from her toolkit, and reorganized her files so the most urgent documents were in a single folder marked Action. Each task was minor, but together they built something solid inside her, proof that she was no longer just reacting to what had been done to her. She was shaping her own ground. That evening, she took a bus to the east side, where the air smelled faintly of the river and the streets were lined with small shops. The bookstore was tucked between a bakery and a secondhand clothing shop, its windows glowing in the early darkness. Inside, shelves overflowed with paperbacks, hardcovers, and stacks of new releases waiting to be shelved. "Mrs. Whitaker?" The owner, a tall man with kind eyes, extended his hand. "I'm Tom. Let's talk." The interview was brief. He needed someone 3 days a week to help with inventory and run the register during busy hours. "You'd get first pick of the staff discount," he added with a smile. Eleanor felt something lift in her chest. "I think I could do that," she said. By the time she left, she had a tentative start date. On the bus ride back, she looked out at the city lights and realized she hadn't thought about Caroline or the house for nearly 2 hours. The absence of that constant ache was its own kind of freedom. Back in room 6, she made tea and sat at her card table. The files were still there, a reminder of the larger battle ahead, but for tonight she let them be. She wrote instead in her notebook, "First interview. Good. Bookstore feels right. Step 1 in the new blueprint complete." The heater clicked on again, filling the room with a gentle hum. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, feeling the quiet not as a weight this time, but as a space she could fill however she chose. She wasn't done, not by a long shot, but she was no longer the woman who had driven away from her own home with tears in her eyes. She was someone else now, someone rebuilding, one choice at a time. The first week at Whitmore Books passed in a rhythm Eleanor hadn't realized she missed. Mornings began with the quiet scrape of keys in the front door, the scent of fresh bread drifting in from the bakery next door. She spent hours arranging displays, checking inventory lists, and greeting the handful of customers who wandered in before lunch. The work was simple, but satisfying, each completed task another stitch in the fabric of her new life. Tom, the owner, gave her the freedom to manage the back room as she saw fit, and she quickly transformed it from a cluttered maze of boxes into a tidy archive where every title had a place. It was on her 3rd morning, as she dusted a shelf of poetry, that she felt the subtle nudge of the other life she was living, the one that had nothing to do with books. On her break, she walked to the post office 2 blocks away, a thick manila envelope in her bag. Inside were copies of public records she had spent weeks collecting. Richard Caldwell's dubious expense filings, underreported rental income, and receipts that didn't match the properties he claimed to maintain. She'd verified each piece twice before including it. The envelope was addressed to the State Department of Revenue's Enforcement Division. She slid it into the outgoing mail slot without hesitation, the sound of it falling into the bin oddly satisfying. Walking back to the bookstore, she felt no guilt. Richard had always carried himself as though rules were for other people, and now the rules would be paying him a visit. She didn't need to watch it happen, she only needed to ensure the right wheels were turning. That afternoon, the shop was quiet except for the faint jazz playing from the radio. Eleanor was at the register, logging a shipment of new arrivals, when the bell over the door chimed. A middle-aged woman in a smart navy coat walked in, her hair pulled back neatly. She browsed for several minutes before bringing a hardback to the counter, a historical biography. "You're new here," the woman said as Eleanor rang up the purchase. "Just started last week," Eleanor replied. "I'm here most Thursdays. My lunch hour escape." She handed over her card, and as Eleanor glanced at it, her eyes caught on the logo, Summit First Bank, and the title beneath the woman's name, Senior Account Specialist. A spark of possibility flickered. Eleanor kept her tone casual. "I used to have an account at Summit. Joint with my daughter. Haven't checked it in years." The woman smiled politely. "We still see that sometimes. People forget they even have them." Eleanor hesitated, then leaned just slightly closer, lowering her voice. "Funny thing, I heard she might have made some large withdrawals. I wouldn't mind knowing if that's true." The woman's expression shifted, not suspicious, but thoughtful. "If you're on the account, you have the right to know. I can't give you details here, but if you happen to stop by my branch on Ashford Street, we could take a look together. Bring your ID." Eleanor thanked her, ringing up the book and slipping it into a bag. As the woman left, the bell chimed again, but Eleanor hardly noticed. That evening, after closing the shop, she made the trip to Ashford Street. The bank was quiet, the last of the customers drifting out as she approached the teller line. The woman from the bookstore appeared almost immediately, ushering her into a small office. "It's exactly as you suspected," she said, pulling up the account on her screen. "Over the last 2 months, there have been 3 withdrawals over the standard limit, each just under the threshold for automatic reporting, all authorized with your name, but the signature isn't consistent." Eleanor looked at the printed transaction list, her pulse steady. "Can I get copies?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "As an account holder, yes, I'll print them now." When Eleanor left the branch 20 minutes later, the papers were tucked safely into her bag alongside Peter's letter. The evidence wasn't just useful, it was precise, targeted, and timed perfectly to intersect with everything else she had set in motion. She walked to the bus stop slowly, the early evening wind carrying the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. Around her, the city moved in its usual rhythm, people hurrying home, shopkeepers locking doors. But for Eleanor, the pace felt different, deliberate. Back in her motel room, she spread the bank documents on the card table next to the file on Richard's tax issues. 2 separate pressure points, each capable of unraveling the stability Caroline and her in-laws depended on. She poured herself a cup of tea, letting the steam rise as she studied the papers. The Caroline in her memory, feverish and small in bed, whispering, "Thanks, Mommy," seemed a lifetime away from the woman who had stood in Eleanor's living room and told her to leave. But Eleanor wasn't here to mourn. She was here to set the board, and every piece was falling exactly where it needed to. She gathered the documents into neat stacks, clipped them, and slipped them into the manila folder marked Active. As she closed the folder, she felt the corners of her mouth turn upward, not in triumph, but in recognition. The house, the accounts, the lies, all of it was now mapped, connected, ready. And Eleanor Whitaker, widow, mother, bookseller, and once called engineer, was no longer waiting for rescue. She was the one drawing the blueprint. The first sign that things were shifting came on a gray Thursday afternoon. Eleanor was in the back of the shop cataloging a box of secondhand novels when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code told her it was from her old neighborhood. She let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Same number. She silenced it, finished the inventory, and only checked the message once the store was quiet again. Mrs. Whitaker. It's Sylvia. The voice on the recording was thinner than she remembered, stripped of its usual superiority. We need to talk. It's about the house. Things have changed. Eleanor set the phone down without replying. Sylvia's things have changed likely meant we've lost control. But she had no intention of letting their panic set her schedule. The next day, a formal letter arrived at the bookstore, forwarded from her motel address. It was from Caroline, handwritten in looping cursive that once had filled pages of Mother's Day cards. "Mom," it began, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but everything is falling apart. The bank accounts are frozen, the tax office is investigating Richard, and Evan has lost his job. I think I understand now what you meant about protecting what you build. I'm sorry. Truly. Please call me." Eleanor read it twice, her hands steady. The apology was there, but so was the desperation. It wasn't contrition born of reflection, it was survival instinct. Still, she allowed herself one slow breath of relief. They were learning, in their way, the cost of tearing down someone else's foundation. That weekend, she took the bus out toward Maple Street. Not to the house, she wasn't ready for that, but to the park where she and Peter used to sit on summer evenings. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of wet leaves. From the bench, she could see the roofline of her home through a break in the trees. It looked the same, yet knowing it was no longer in their control changed everything. She stayed there for nearly an hour, sipping coffee from a paper cup, letting memories rise and settle. The day they'd moved in, carrying boxes through the front door, Caroline's first steps across the living room floor, Peter sanding the porch rail, humming off-key. She didn't need to stand in the house to claim it in her heart. When she finally returned to the motel, she found another envelope waiting. This one from Alan, her attorney. Inside was the formal notice. The injunction had held, the attempted sale blocked. Richard's financial troubles were now officially a matter for the courts. Alan's note was brief. "They won't be able to touch the house without your consent. Call me when you're ready to discuss next steps." Eleanor set the letter on the table beside Peter's. The two pieces of paper felt like bookends on a long chapter. One from the past urging her to protect, one from the present confirming she had. In the days that followed, she noticed a change in herself. She still worked the quiet hours at the bookstore, still took her evening walks, but there was a new undercurrent, a calm rooted in having already won the battle that mattered. The calls from Caroline continued, though Eleanor never picked up. She didn't need to hear more pleas or excuses. The distance was its own kind of boundary, one she intended to keep. One Tuesday evening, as she was closing the shop, Tom approached her with a paper bag. "The bakery had extra croissants, thought you might want some." She smiled, accepting them. "Thank you, Tom." As she walked back to the motel with the warm bag in her hands, she realized how different her sense of home had become. It wasn't tied to walls or property deeds anymore, though she still intended to keep the house. Home was in the steadiness of her own choices, the dignity she carried, the people who treated her with respect. The next week, she made one final trip to the house, not to move back in, not yet, but to stand at the threshold. The locks had been changed back to her keys. The yard was quiet. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let the air of the place settle around her. It was as if the walls themselves exhaled in recognition. She walked through each room slowly. The furniture was out of place, the kitchen cupboards nearly bare, but the structure was sound. In the living room, she opened the curtains wide, letting the light in. "I kept my promise, Peter," she said softly. There was no audience, no applause, just the quiet truth of it. She had protected what they'd built. Before leaving, she placed a single vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, not as a signal to anyone else, but as a private marker. She had been here, she had stood her ground, and she had done it without needing to shout. Locking the door behind her, Eleanor walked back down the path, her stride unhurried. The house was safe. Her life was her own. And for the first time in a long while, she felt entirely at peace. The knock on Eleanor's motel door came just after dawn. She was still in her robe, making tea, when she opened it to find Caroline standing there. Her daughter looked smaller than Eleanor remembered. Hair unkempt, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Mom, please." "I didn't know where else to go." Caroline's voice trembled. "We lost the house. The bank's taken the cars. Evan's gone. I can't pay rent anywhere." Eleanor stepped aside, letting her in. Caroline's hands shook as she clutched a folded stack of papers. "They're suing me. An old credit account in my name. Evan used it, but it's mine legally. I don't have a lawyer." Eleanor read the notice quickly. It was small compared to the battles she'd fought. A local creditor's claim for less than a month's rent at her motel. She looked up at Caroline. "I'll help you get this dismissed, but I'm not giving you money." Caroline's eyes flickered with both relief and disappointment. "That's fair, I guess." 2 days later, Eleanor sat beside her at the county courthouse. The hearing was over in minutes. The judge, unimpressed with the creditor's sloppy paperwork, dismissed the case outright. Carolyn exhaled shakily, leaning toward her mother. "Thank you." Eleanor nodded, but didn't touch her. "That's what I could do for you." It was barely a week later when the larger case, the one that had been building for months, reached its final stage. Eleanor, in a dark blue dress and the pearl earrings Peter had given her on their 20th anniversary, stood with Alan at her side. Across the aisle sat Richard and Sylvia, stiff in their seats, and Carolyn, her hands twisting in her lap. The proceedings were clinical, almost bloodless. Alan laid out Eleanor's documented investments into the house, the new roof, the foundation work, the renovations, every receipt neat and unassailable. The opposing counsel tried to argue family gift, but the judge's eyebrows arched at the specificity of the paperwork. "Mrs. Whitaker," Judge Harmon said at last, "the evidence shows you are the rightful co-owner of the property. The court grants you full possession, effective immediately." It was a victory without theatrics, just a clean, decisive click of the gavel. Eleanor's heartbeat was steady. Outside the courtroom, Caroline lingered. "So, it's yours now." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "It always was." Then softer. "You can stay if you need to, but on my terms." Caroline shook her head. "No, I think I need to start somewhere new. I've done enough damage here." There was no embrace, no sudden healing, just a nod from each woman, an acknowledgement of what had been and what would never be again. 2 afternoons later, Eleanor unlocked the front door of her house. The late winter light spilled across the floorboards, catching dust motes in the air. The rooms were empty now, stripped of the Miller's presence, holding only the echo of Eleanor's own steps. She moved through the house slowly, reacquainting herself with the spaces. The kitchen where Peter used to hum while chopping vegetables, the hallway lined with photographs she'd boxed away for safety, the living room that had once hosted Christmas mornings and late-night talks. Finally, she entered the small alcove where Peter's memorial shelf stood. She had dusted it herself the day after the eviction notice was served, but today she added something new. A vase of fresh white lilies. "They tried to take it all, Peter," she murmured, "but I learned from you. Build strong, stand steady." She stood there a while, letting the quiet settle deep into her bones. There was no need for celebration, no urge to broadcast her victory. The satisfaction was in knowing she had done it without lowering herself to their level, in keeping her dignity intact while reclaiming what was hers. Later, she opened the front windows, letting the crisp air flow through. The house smelled of wood polish and lilies, and for the first time in months, it felt like home again. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange behind the rooftops, Eleanor sat at the dining table with a cup of tea. The flowers on Peter's shelf caught the fading light, glowing softly. She smiled to herself. Not the giddy smile of a sudden win, but the quiet, grounded smile of someone who had weathered the storm and come through on her own terms. The war was over, and in the silence, she had been crowned.